The acid rain clattered against the rusted metal structures of Xylos, creating a haunting symphony of decay. Kale pulled his weathered coat tighter around his shoulders as he navigated through the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving mining outpost. The air hung heavy with chemical compounds, forcing him to breathe through a filtration mask that had seen better days. Overhead, a distant sun struggled to penetrate the thick, ashen clouds, casting the landscape in a perpetual twilight. Kale had been on Xylos for 3 days now, methodically searching abandoned facilities for salvageable tech. His ship, parked in what remained of a loading bay, wasn't going anywhere until he found the energy stabilizer he needed. Not that he was in any hurry to leave. One desolate planet was much the same as another when you had nowhere to call home. As he approached a half-collapsed building that had once been the Mining Operations Command Center, Kale checked his scanner. The readings showed faint power signatures, promising. He adjusted the worn tool belt at his waist, his fingers briefly brushing against the damaged data chip he always carried. For a moment, the ghostly image of a child's face flickered in his mind, but he pushed the memory away with practiced efficiency. The interior of the command center was a maze of collapsed corridors and exposed wiring. Kale moved carefully, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The life support systems had long since failed, leaving the air stale and thin. Perfect preservation conditions for tech, though no organic matter to corrode the components. He had just begun examining a promising-looking control panel when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in this mechanical graveyard. Not the groan of settling metal or the whistle of acid whine through broken walls, but something almost musical. A soft humming, like a muffled lullaby. Kale froze, his hand instinctively moving to the pulse pistol at his hip. Scavengers weren't uncommon on abandoned worlds like Xylos, and they weren't known for sharing territory peacefully. But this sound didn't match the typical noises of other humans. Curiosity overrode caution. Kale followed the sound deeper into the facility, through a narrow passage where the ceiling had partially collapsed. The humming grew louder, accompanied by a faint blue glow emanating from around a corner. He slowed his approach, peering cautiously into what had once been a small storage area. What he saw made him blink in disbelief. A child, or something like a child, huddled against the far wall, partially concealed beneath a bent sheet of metal. Her skin gave off a soft blue luminescence that pulsed gently with her breathing. She was small, perhaps the equivalent of 6 or 7 human years, with disproportionately large eyes of the deepest violet he had ever seen. The humming came from her, a single-note melody repeated in a pattern. But what caught Kale's attention most were her legs. They were withered, almost atrophied, wrapped in dirty strips of cloth. They lay useless before her as she used her arms to draw intricate patterns in the dust on the floor. The child sensed his presence. Her humming stopped abruptly, and those enormous purple eyes locked onto his. There was no fear in them, only sharp intelligence and a hint of defiance. Kale took an involuntary step backward. This was not his problem. He had learned the hard way that involvement meant pain, that attachment led to loss. He had a job to do. Find parts, fix his ship, move on. The same routine that had kept him alive, if not exactly living, for years now. But as he turned to leave, the memory surged again, stronger this time. A different child, a different pair of eyes looking to him for protection. Eyes that had trusted him, right until the end. Eyes he had failed. Damn it, he muttered under his breath, his shoulders sagging with the weight of a decision he knew he would regret. He turned back toward the alien child, who watched him with unblinking intensity. Before he could speak, a shadow detached itself from the darkness behind the child. Kale barely had time to register the movement before something hard and cold pressed against his throat. The edge of a makeshift blade, its tip glinting dangerously in the dim light. "Move and you die," hissed a voice in his ear. Female, with the same musical quality as the child's humming, but hard as the blade against his skin. "Hands where I can see them." Kale slowly raised his hands, careful not to make any sudden movements. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said, keeping his voice even. "I'm a scavenger, just looking for parts." The pressure against his throat lessened slightly, but didn't disappear. His assailant stepped around to face him, keeping the blade steady. She was clearly of the same species as the child, taller, with the same luminescent skin, though hers glowed with a slightly deeper blue. A jagged scar ran from her right temple down to her jaw, interrupting the natural patterns of her skin. Her eyes, the same violet as the child's, regarded him with naked hostility. Scavenger, she spat the word like a curse. Another vulture picking at the bones of our misfortune. Did the others send you to finish what they started? I don't know what you're talking about, Kale replied honestly. I'm alone. My ship needed repairs, so I came looking for parts. That's all. The woman, Kale assumed she was the child's guardian, studied him with narrowed eyes. Her gaze flicked to his belt, noting the tools that marked him as a tech specialist rather than a common looter. You have 10 seconds to turn around and leave, she said finally. And if you tell anyone what you saw here. A fit of coughing interrupted her threat. The child behind her doubled over, her thin shoulders shaking with the effort. The guardian's attention immediately shifted, her posture changing from threatening to protective as she knelt beside the girl. The blade, Kale noted, remained firmly in her hand. He should have taken the opportunity to leave. Every instinct honed from years of solitary survival screamed at him to walk away. Instead, his eyes were drawn to the antiquated air filter unit humming weakly in the corner of their makeshift shelter. Even from this distance, he could see it was failing, its intake valves clogged with the corrosive dust that permeated everything on Xylos. Your filter's dying, he said, nodding toward the unit. The girl can't breathe this air. It's toxic even for adapted lungs. The Guardian's eyes flashed with renewed suspicion. What do you care? Kale shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, even as unwelcome empathy tightened his chest. I can fix it. Make it work better. The kid will breathe easier. And what would you want in return? She asked, her voice cold. Nothing comes free on Xylos. Nothing, Kale said. The word surprised even him. Look, I'll fix the filter, then I'll go. You'll never see me again. Deal. The Guardian remained silent, clearly torn between distrust and necessity. Behind her, the child coughed again, a painful, rattling sound. Fine, she relented, though she didn't lower the blade. Fix it. Touch nothing else. Come nowhere near Lyra. Then leave. Lyra. The child had a name now. Kale wished she didn't. He moved cautiously toward the air filter, acutely aware of the Guardian's eyes, tracking his every movement. The unit was even worse up close, an outdated model that would have been considered obsolete even before Xylos was abandoned. But it was salvageable. He knelt beside it and began to work, his fingers moving with practiced precision as he disassembled the outer casing. What's your name? He asked without looking up, keeping his tone casual as he extracted the clogged filter element. A long silence followed, and he thought she might not answer. Then, reluctantly, Ilera. Kale nodded, but didn't press for more information. He focused on cleaning the filter, using a small tool from his belt to scrape away the accumulated crud. As he worked, he became aware of a presence beside him. Not Ilera, who still stood at a vigilant distance, but Lyra. The child had pulled herself closer using her arms, her useless legs dragging behind her. Her luminescence brightened with curiosity as she watched his hands work. Back, Lyra, Ilera commanded sharply. The child hesitated, then reluctantly retreated, though her eyes never left Kale's tools. He pretended not to notice her interest as he continued working. The relative quiet was shattered by a sudden, deafening crack from outside. The entire structure shuddered, dust and small debris raining down from the ceiling. Lyra let out a frightened sound, and even Ilera staggered slightly. Structural collapse. Kale explained, raising his voice over the continuing rumble. This whole section is unstable. The acid rain has eaten through the support beams. He pointed to a growing puddle in the corner where caustic liquid had begun to drip through a new crack in the ceiling. That's going to get worse. As if to punctuate his warning, another groan echoed through the building, followed by a crash from somewhere deeper in the complex. The puddle of acid rain was expanding rapidly. We need to move, Ilera said, her voice tight. She went to Lyra, scooping the child into her arms with practiced ease. There's another section, more stable, through there. She nodded toward a narrow doorway. Kale gathered his tools and a partially repaired filter. Lead the way. Alara hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with turning her back on him, but another ominous crack from overhead decided the matter. She hurried through the doorway. Lyra clutched protectively against her chest. Kale followed, ducking to avoid a hanging wire that sparked dangerously. They navigated through a series of collapsed corridors, Alara moving with the confidence of someone who had mapped every possible escape route. The building continued to groan around them, but the sounds grew more distant as they moved away from the failing section. Finally, they emerged into a larger room, what might have once been a communal area. The ceiling here was intact, the walls more stable. Alara set Lyra down gently on a makeshift bed of salvaged cushions and padding before turning back to Kale, her posture still defensive but less overtly hostile. "Your filter," Kale said, holding out the device. "I wasn't finished, but I cleared the worst of the blockage. It should work better now." Alara took it without a word of thanks, quickly setting it up in the corner of their new shelter. When she switched it on, the difference was immediately noticeable. The air felt cleaner, less acrid. "You should leave now," she said, though there was less conviction in her voice than before. Kale nodded. "Yeah, I should." He turned toward the exit, then paused. "That section isn't going to be the last to collapse. This whole complex is dying. You shouldn't stay here. We have nowhere else to go," Alara replied simply. Kale walked away, forcing himself not to look back at Lyra's curious eyes or the desperate determination in Alara's stance. This wasn't his problem. He had his own survival to worry about. Yet as he made his way back to his ship, the image of the child with the withered legs stayed with him, merging with older memories he'd spent years trying to forget. By the time he reached his small craft, he'd already made a decision that defied all his hard-learned lessons about self-preservation. He wouldn't be leaving Xylos just yet. The following morning, Kale set up a temporary camp not far from the command center, close enough to keep an eye on the building where Alara and Lyra sheltered, but far enough to not appear threatening. He told himself he was still searching for the energy stabilizer his ship needed, which wasn't entirely a lie, but he found his attention constantly drawn to the broken windows of the complex. From his vantage point, he occasionally caught glimpses of movement inside. Once, he saw Lyra at a window, her small face illuminated by her own gentle glow as she stared out at the bleak landscape. She spotted him and stared for a long moment before disappearing back into the shadows. Kale spent the day ostensibly scavenging, but in reality, he was gathering very specific components. A pair of small servo motors from a maintenance drone, lightweight metal struts from collapsed scaffolding, power cells from emergency lighting systems, and various connecting pieces. With each item he collected, an idea took clearer shape in his mind. That evening, as Xylos' distant sun dipped below the horizon, casting the landscape in deep shadows, Kale approached the complex again. He carried a package wrapped in a piece of tarp, food rations he'd brought from his ship, more than he could afford to spare, but he'd made his choice. He found Alara waiting for him just inside the entrance, her makeshift weapon at her side, but not raised. She regarded him with a mixture of suspicion and resignation. "You're still here," she said. It wasn't a question. "Found some food," Kale replied, holding out the package. "Protein concentrates. Not tasty, but nutritious." Alara hesitated before taking the offering. "Why are you doing this?" Kale looked past her to where Lyra sat in the corner, pretending not to watch them while her fingers traced patterns on the floor. "Let's just say I'm trying to balance some scales," he answered cryptically. Over the next few days, a tentative routine developed. Kale would bring food or repair something in their shelter, the heating unit, the water recycler, anything to make their precarious existence slightly more comfortable. Alara's hostility gradually gave way to cautious acceptance, though she remained vigilant, especially when he was near Lyra. The child, for her part, grew bolder. Each day, she dragged herself a little closer to where Kale worked, watching his hands with fascination as he manipulated tools and technology. He pretended not to notice, but occasionally would explain what he was doing in simple terms, as if talking to himself. Gotta reconnect this circuit here, bridge the power flow. See how the light changes from red to green? That means it's working again. Lyra never spoke, but her eyes absorbed everything. Kale wondered if she could speak at all, or if whatever had damaged her legs had affected other functions as well. At night, Kale would return to his camp and work on his secret project. By the glow of a portable lamp, he assembled the components he'd been gathering, crafting a device that took shape slowly but surely, a mobility aid designed for Lyra's small frame. It would be crude, nothing like the advanced prosthetics available in civilized systems, but it might give her some independence, some freedom from the prison of her own body. On the 7th day, disaster struck. The acid rain, which had been a constant but manageable presence, suddenly intensified into a downpour more caustic than any Kale had witnessed since arriving. The very air seemed to burn with chemical reactions, and alarming alerts sounded on his environmental scanner. He hurriedly packed up his camp and sprinted for the command center, the partially completed mobility device clutched under his coat. The rain sizzled against his protective gear, eating through the outer layer with frightening speed. Inside, he found Ilera frantically moving containers to catch leaks from the ceiling. The air filter was working overtime, but struggling against the toxic fumes that seeped through every crack. "What's happening?" she demanded when she saw him. "Chemical storm," Kale explained, catching his breath. "Happens sometimes on mining planets after they're abandoned. Something in the atmosphere destabilized." A small sound drew his attention to Lyra, huddled in the corner. Her breathing labored even with the filter working. The toxic air was affecting her worse than the adults. "We need to seal this place better," Kale said, already moving to action. He pulled tools from his belt and began reinforcing the weakest points where the acidic air was entering. Ilera worked alongside him without argument, their previous wariness set aside in the face of immediate danger. Hours passed as the storm raged outside. They worked in grim silence, moving from one leak to another, using whatever materials they could find to create seals. Occasionally, the building would shudder under a particularly strong gust of chemical wind, and they would freeze, eyes meeting in shared concern. Finally, when they had done all they could, they collapsed in exhaustion near the center of the room, as far from the exterior walls as possible. Lyra had fallen into a fitful sleep, her luminescence dimmed to a faint glow. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the sounds of the storm and their own ragged breathing. It was Ilera who finally broke it. "What did you mean?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "About balancing scales." Kale stared at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of working with machinery. "I had a daughter," he said, the words feeling like broken glass in his throat. "About her age. Different species, obviously, but same eyes, somehow. Same curiosity." Ilera waited, sensing there was more. "I was chief engineer on a terraforming project," Kale continued after a long pause. "Cutting-edge technology designed to make uninhabitable planets livable. My daughter was with me. Her mother had died years before, so she went where I went. We were like a team." He closed his eyes, the memories he'd suppressed for so long flooding back with painful clarity. There was a malfunction in the atmosphere processor. Systems started failing. I thought I could fix it. I was so sure I could fix it. I told her to stay in the residential pod while I went to the main facility. Promised I'd be right back. His voice grew hoarse. By the time I realized it couldn't be fixed, that the whole system was going to catastrophically fail, it was too late to reach her. The residential section was the first to go. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken grief. "It wasn't just my daughter," Kale added. 17 people died that day because I was too arrogant to sound the evacuation in time. I thought I could solve the problem. I thought. "You couldn't save her," Ilera said softly, not a question, but a recognition of his pain. Kale nodded, unable to speak further. After a moment, Ilera turned her gaze to Lyra's sleeping form. "We weren't supposed to be here," she said. "We were part of a research team, the last of our kind to volunteer. Our planet was dying, so we came to study other worlds that might support us. What happened? Kale asked. Our ship malfunctioned, entering Xylos' atmosphere. The pilot tried to compensate, but she gestured vaguely. We crashed. There were 12 of us. Now there's just Lyra and me. Her parents were my sister and her bondmate. Her legs? Alara's expression darkened. Crushed in a crash. We had medical equipment, but most of it was destroyed. I did what I could, but she trailed off, the guilt in her voice a mirror of his own. She hasn't walked since. Hasn't spoken, either, though I know she can. The trauma silenced her. You've kept her alive, Kale said. In this place, that's a miracle in itself. Survival isn't enough, Alara replied, her gaze still fixed on Lyra. She deserves more than just existing in this dying place. The storm continued through the night, forcing them to remain in close quarters. Despite the circumstances, or perhaps because of them, something shifted between Kale and Alara. The shared confessions had created a fragile trust, a recognition of similar wounds. By morning, the storm had subsided, leaving behind a landscape even more corroded than before. But it had also left something else, a resolve in Kale that had been absent for years. When Lyra woke, coughing but alive, Kale made his decision. He would complete the mobility device. He would help this child walk again. And somehow, they would all find a way off this doomed planet. The next 2 days passed in relative calm. Kale continued to repair systems in their shelter while secretly working on the mobility device whenever he returned to his ship. Alara still watched him closely, but there was less suspicion in her gaze now, replaced by something that might have been the beginning of trust. On the 3rd day after the storm, their fragile peace was shattered. Kale was returning from his ship, the now completed mobility device carefully wrapped and hidden under his coat, when he noticed unusual marks in the corroded soil, boot prints that weren't his own. He quickened his pace, a cold dread settling in his stomach. As he approached the command center, he heard it, voices harsh and unfamiliar, echoing from inside. Kale drew his pulse pistol and moved silently toward the entrance, keeping to the shadows. Through a broken window, he could see 3 figures in environmental suits moving through the space, appending the meager possessions that made up Alara and Lyra's home. Scavengers, the dangerous kind that didn't limit themselves to abandoned technology. Of Alara and Lyra, there was no sign, which gave Kale hope they had managed to hide. He was considering his options when a child's frightened cry cut through the air, followed by Alara's voice raised in desperate anger. The scavengers converged on a sound coming from a storage compartment Kale hadn't known existed, a hidden space beneath the floor panels. Without further hesitation, Kale burst through the entrance, his pistol raised. "Step away from there," he commanded, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The scavengers whirled, their own weapons coming up. There were 3 of them, all human, their faces obscured by breathing masks, but their postures clearly aggressive. Well, said the largest of them, a man with a jagged scar visible even through his mask. "Looks like someone else found the aliens first. You willing to share, friend? Exotic specimens fetch a good price in certain markets." The implication made Kale's blood run cold. Slavers, then, not just scavengers. "They're not for sale," he said, "and I'm not your friend." "Don't be stupid," another slaver said, gesturing with his weapon. "There's 3 of us, one of you. Even if you get shot off, you won't get us all. And then what happens to your little blue friends? Be reasonable. We can cut you in." Kale knew they were right about the odds. But before he could respond, a high-pitched sound filled the air, a piercing, disorienting noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The slavers clutched at their heads, momentarily disoriented. Kale recognized it immediately. The same melodic pattern Lyra had been humming when he first found her, but amplified to painful levels. Her species must have some natural ability to produce sonic frequencies beyond normal range. Taking advantage of the distraction, Kale fired at the nearest slaver, catching him in the shoulder and sending him sprawling. The second one recovered quickly and returned fire, forcing Kale to dive behind a broken console. In the chaos that followed, Kale caught glimpses of Alara emerging from the hidden compartment, wielding her makeshift blade with deadly precision as she engaged the third slaver. The sonic disruption continued, giving them a slight advantage, but the slavers were armed and desperate. A shot grazed Kale's arm, burning through his coat and searing the flesh beneath. He gritted his teeth against the pain and returned fire, catching his attacker in the leg. The man went down with a cry. The largest slaver, realizing the tide had turned, made a desperate lunge toward the hidden compartment where Lyra must still be hiding. Alara screamed a warning, but she was engaged with the third slaver and couldn't intercept. Kale launched himself across the room, abandoning his cover to tackle the man before he could reach Lyra. They crashed to the floor together, grappling for control. The slaver was bigger, stronger, fueled by desperation and greed. He slammed a fist into Kale's injured arm, sending waves of agony through his body. Through the haze of pain, Kale saw movement from the corner of his eye. Lyra had emerged from hiding. Her small form dragged itself across the floor toward them, her face set in fierce determination despite her fear. "Stay back," Kale shouted, but it was too late. The slaver saw her too and reached for her with grimy hands. In that moment, something snapped in Kale. All the grief, the guilt, the years of self-imposed isolation crystallized into a single, overwhelming imperative: protect this child. Not fail. Not again. With a roar that contained all his pent-up anguish, Kale drove his fist into the slaver's throat. The man choked, his grip loosening just enough for Kale to reach his fallen pistol. One shot, point blank, and the threat was eliminated. Across the room, Alara had dispatched her opponent as well. The third slaver, wounded and outnumbered, fled through the entrance, disappearing into the toxic landscape. In the sudden silence that followed, Kale turned to Lyra, who had stopped a few feet away, her enormous eyes wide with fear and something else. Recognition, perhaps, of the lengths to which this stranger would go to protect her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice hoarse from exertion. Lyra shook her head slightly, then, to his astonishment, spoke for the first time since he'd met her. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice small but clear, with the same musical quality as her humming. Kale looked down at his arm, where blood seeped through the burned fabric of his coat. "It's nothing," he said, though the pain suggested otherwise. Alara rushed to Lyra's side, checking her for injuries before gathering the child into a protective embrace. Over Lyra's head, her eyes met Kale's, filled with gratitude and concern. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "The one who escaped will bring back others. This place isn't safe anymore." Kale nodded, his decision already made. "My ship. It's not much, but it's space-worthy. With some adjustments, it can fit all three of us." "You would take us with you?" Alara asked, surprise evident in her voice despite the urgency of their situation. "Yes," Kale said simply. Then, remembering the package he dropped during the fight, he retrieved it from where it had fallen. "But first, I have something for Lyra." He unwrapped the mobility device carefully, revealing a lightweight framework of metal and salvage components. It was designed to attach around Lyra's waist and legs, with small servo motors at the joints that would respond to her natural movements, amplifying whatever limited mobility she had. "It's not perfect," Kale explained as Lyra stared at the device with wonder. "And it's going to need adjustments as you grow. But it should let you walk, maybe even run, eventually." Alara's hand went to her mouth, her luminescence brightening with emotion. "You made this?" "When?" "Been working on it for days," Kale admitted. "Let's see if it fits before those slavers come back with reinforcements." The next few minutes were tense as Kale helped Alara attach the device to Lyra's small frame. The child remained silent but cooperative, her eyes never leaving the mechanical legs that now extended alongside her withered ones. "It works with neural pathways," Kale explained as he made final adjustments. "It'll take some practice, but if you think about walking, it should respond. The servos amplify even the smallest muscle movements." When everything was secure, he and Alara helped Lyra stand. The device hummed softly, supporting her weight. Lyra's face was a study in concentration, her brow furrowed as she focused on the unfamiliar sensation of being upright. "Try to take a step," Kale encouraged gently. "Just think about moving forward." Lyra's first attempt resulted in a jerky motion, the servos responding unevenly to her commands. She would have fallen if not for their supporting hands. Her second attempt was similarly awkward, but by the third, something clicked, a connection between mind and machine that smoothed the movement. Her fourth step was taken alone, without their support. It was small, uncertain, the mechanical legs whirring with effort, but it was unmistakably a step. Then another, and another. Lyra's face transformed, her luminescence brightening to an almost blinding intensity as joy overtook concentration. She laughed, a sound like crystal chimes, and took several more steps, each steadier than the last. Alara made a choked sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob, as she watched her niece walk for the first time. Tears streaked down her face, leaving glowing trails on her blue skin. Lyra turned and walked back toward them, wobbling, imperfect but walking nonetheless. She reached Alara first, practically falling into her arms with the momentum. They embraced, both glowing so brightly that Kale had to squint. Then, to his surprise, Lyra pulled away from Alara and turned toward him. With determined focus, she walked to where he knelt and threw her small arms around his neck. The unfamiliar sensation of being hugged froze Kale momentarily before he gently returned the embrace, careful of her fragile frame. "Thank you," she whispered against his ear, her voice no longer silenced by trauma. Over Lyra's shoulder, Kale's eyes met Alara's. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding deeper than words, a recognition of shared pain and the possibility of healing. Alara moved forward and placed her hand on Kale's uninjured arm, a gesture of gratitude and connection that said more than any words could. The moment was broken by the distant sound of approaching engines. The escaped slaver had returned with reinforcements sooner than expected. "We need to go," Kale said, rising quickly. "Now!" They gathered what few possessions they could carry: Alara's blade, the air filter, a small pouch that seemed to hold particular significance for her. Lyra insisted on walking herself, though Kale stayed close in case the mobility device failed. They left the command center for the last time, heading toward Kale's ship under the dim light of Xylos' distant sun. Behind them, the sounds of the approaching slavers grew louder. Kale's ship sat where he had left it, a small, battered vessel that had seen better days. It wasn't designed for passengers, but it would have to do. He hurried them inside, sealing the airlock just as the first of the slavers' vehicles appeared on the horizon. The interior was cramped, a single pilot's seat, a small cargo area, and minimal life support. Alara and Lyra pressed themselves into the cargo space as Kale took the controls, his injured arm protesting with every movement. "Hold on," he warned as he initiated the launch sequence. "This won't be the smoothest takeoff." The engines roared to life, vibrating the entire vessel. Outside, the slavers had reached the landing site and were firing ineffectually at the ship's hull. Kale engaged the thrusters, and with a bone-jarring lurch, they lifted off from the corroded surface of Xylos. The ship strained against Xylos' gravity. Systems that hadn't been properly maintained in years now pushed to their limits. Warning lights flashed across the control panel, but Kale ignored them, focused solely on putting distance between them and the planet's surface. Finally, they broke through the ashen clouds into the clear void of space. Kale allowed himself a moment of relief before turning his attention to plotting a course. He was vaguely aware of movement behind him as Lyra pulled herself forward to stare out the viewport, her eyes wide with wonder at the stars spread out before them. "It's beautiful," she breathed, her small hand touching the transparent material separating them from the vacuum. "Where will we go?" Alara asked, joining them at the viewport. In the artificial gravity of the ship, Lyra was adapting to her mobility device quickly, her movements becoming more natural with each passing minute. Kale considered their options. His ship had limited range, and they would need a place where two aliens and a human with a questionable past wouldn't draw too much attention. "There's a trading post on Helios Minor," he said finally. It's about 3 days' journey from here. Mixed species, no questions asked. We can resupply there, maybe find passage to somewhere better. Somewhere with grass, Lyra said suddenly, and water that doesn't burn. I saw pictures in the database before the crash. Is that real? The innocent question squeezed something in Kale's chest. Yes, he said softly. That's real, and we'll find it. As the ship hummed around them, carrying them away from Xylos and toward an uncertain future, Kale felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. It was fragile, tentative, but undeniably present. The journey to Helios Minor was challenging. The ship, designed for a single occupant, strained under the demands of supporting 3 lives. They took turns sleeping in a single bunk, rationed their meager supplies, and made constant adjustments to Lyra's mobility device as she grew more confident with it. Despite the cramped conditions, or perhaps because of them, the fragile connection between them strengthened. Lyra's voice, silent for so long, filled the small cabin with questions about the stars, planets, and the universe beyond. Kale answered each one with patience he didn't know he possessed, finding unexpected joy in her curiosity. Alara watched these interactions with cautious optimism. Her protective instincts remained strong, but she could see the positive effect Kale had on Lyra. For the first time since the crash, the child was animated, engaged, her trauma temporarily overshadowed by new discoveries. On the 3rd day of their journey, Kale allowed Lyra to sit on his lap at the controls, guiding her small hands over the navigation panel. This is how we chart our course through the stars, he explained, showing her how to read the cosmic mapping system. Each of these points is a different solar system, and we can go to any of them, Lyra asked, her violet eyes wide with wonder. Eventually, Kale replied, some are farther than others. Some might not be safe for us. But there are countless worlds out there, Lyra. Someday, you'll find one that feels like home. Later, while Lyra slept, Alara joined Kale at the controls. They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching the stars streak past the viewport. She's never taken to anyone like this, Alara said finally. Not since her parents died in the crash. Kale glanced at her. Kids are resilient. Given half a chance, they'll bounce back from almost anything. Not without help, Alara countered softly. Not without someone who cares. She hesitated, then added, thank you. Not just for the device, but for seeing her. Really seeing her. Kale nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude he wasn't sure he deserved. The mobility device will need adjustments as she grows. I can show you how to maintain it. You sound like you're planning to leave, Alara observed, her luminescence dimming slightly. Before Kale could respond, the ship's proximity alarm sounded. A small trading vessel had appeared on their scanners on an intercept course. Unidentified vessel, crackled a voice over the communication system. This is the merchant ship Stardust. We've detected unusual energy signatures from your craft. Identify yourselves. Kale exchanged a worried glance with Alara. His ship's systems were jury-rigged at best, and the energy signature of Lyra's mobility device might be registering as something suspicious. Trading vessel Stardust. This is the independent salvager Nomad, Kale responded, using the name he'd given his ship years ago. We're en route to Helios Minor for resupply. Any unusual readings are likely from my damaged power coupling. Nothing to concern yourselves with. There was a pause, then, Nomad, our scans show 3 life forms aboard your single-occupant vessel. Current regulations require proper documentation for all passengers, especially through this sector. Please prepare for boarding inspection. Kale muted the communication channel. Refugees from Xylos won't have documentation, he muttered. Especially non-human refugees. What do we do? Alara asked, her hand instinctively moving toward where Lyra slept. Kale considered their options. They could run, but his ship was in no condition for a prolonged chase. They could fight, but they were outgunned and outnumbered. Neither choice was likely to end well. We hide you, he decided. There's a smuggler's compartment beneath the floor panels in the cargo area. It's small, but it should fit you both. Alara hesitated only briefly before nodding. She gently woke Lyra, explaining in hushed tones that they needed to play a hiding game. The child was groggy but cooperative, allowing herself to be guided to the hidden compartment. Kale opened the concealed hatch, revealing a space barely large enough for the two of them. "It'll be cramped, and you'll need to be absolutely silent," he warned. "No matter what you hear. Can you do that, Lyra?" The child nodded solemnly. "Like when the bad men came before?" "Exactly like that," Kale confirmed, his chest tightening at the reminder of what she'd already endured. "But I'll be right here the whole time. I won't let anything happen to you." As they settled into the cramped space, Ilara's eyes met his. "Be careful," she whispered before he closed the hatch, sealing them inside. Kale straightened up and reopened the communication channel. "Stardust, this is Nomad. I'm a solo operator. Your scanners must be malfunctioning, but you're welcome to board and see for yourself." He disabled the proximity alarms and steered the ship to a halt, allowing the larger vessel to pull alongside. Through the viewport, he could see the trading ship was well-maintained but heavily armed, likely a legitimate merchant outfit that had adapted to the dangerous realities of Outer Rim commerce. The docking procedure was swift and efficient. Kale felt a slight shudder as the airlock sealed between the two vessels. Taking a deep breath, he prepared his story one last time before moving to greet his unwelcome visitors. The airlock cycled open to reveal 3 armed individuals. 2 humans and a tall, reptilian being with iridescent scales. They wore the mismatched uniforms of independent traders, but their weapons and bearings suggested military training. Captain Vickers introduced the lead human, a square-jawed woman with close-cropped gray hair. "And you are?" "Kale. Just Kale." He kept his posture relaxed despite the pulse pistols aimed in his direction. "Like I said, solo salvager. Just picked up some parts from Xylos, heading to Helios Minor to trade." Captain Vickers nodded to her companions, who began a thorough inspection of the small vessel. Kale felt sweat beading on his forehead as they methodically checked every compartment, storage unit, and system panel. "Unusual energy signature," noted the reptilian crew member, reading from a handheld scanner. "Not consistent with standard power systems." "That will be my modified engine coupling," Kale explained smoothly. "Had to jury-rig it after a methane pocket explosion on Xylos damaged the original. Not pretty, but it works." The captain studied him with narrowed eyes. "Our scans definitely registered multiple life forms. Mind explaining that?" "Look around." Kale gestured to the cramped cabin. "Where exactly would I hide passengers? Besides, who in their right mind would want to hitch a ride on this bucket of bolts?" This self-deprecating joke earned a slight smile from one of the humans, but Captain Vickers remained unmoved. "Check the cargo hold again," she ordered. "Use the bioscanner this time." Kale's heart sank. A bioscanner would detect Ilara and Lyra, even through the shielded compartment. He had seconds to make a decision. "You want the truth, Captain," he said suddenly, drawing all eyes back to him. "Your scanner did pick up something, but it's not what you think." He moved slowly to his sleeping area and reached beneath the bunk, extracting a small container. Inside was the damaged data chip he always carried, the one containing the last images of his daughter. "This contains a quantum-paired memory core," he explained, the partial truth coming easily. "It's linked to a similar core at a research facility in the Centauri system. They're conducting experiments in long-distance neural networking. The energy signature you detected is the quantum resonance between the paired cores." He handed the container to Captain Vickers, his expression carefully neutral. "It's not exactly legal in all jurisdictions, which is why I didn't mention it initially. But it's harmless, just data transmission, nothing dangerous." The captain examined the chip, which did indeed emit a faint energy signature thanks to its damaged state. "This looks like a standard memory core, albeit damaged." "That's the point," Kale replied. "The modifications are internal. Hard to detect unless you know what you're looking for. I'm just a courier. They pay well for discretion." There was a long, tense moment as Captain Vickers considered his explanation. The reptilian officer had returned from the cargo hold, shaking his head slightly. They had found nothing with their scans. Finally, the captain handed the chip back to Kale. "Next time, declare all unusual cargo, even if it's just experimental tech. These days, anything out of the ordinary gets flagged as a potential threat. Kale nodded, relief washing through him. Understood, Captain. Won't happen again. See that it doesn't. She gestured to her crew to return to their ship. Safe travels to Helios Minor, Salvageur. Keep that engine coupling maintained. It's putting out far too much radiation for comfort. After they had departed and the airlock was secure, Kale waited a full 10 minutes before returning to the cargo area. He knelt and opened the hidden compartment, where Alara and Lyra were pressed together in the confined space, their luminescence dimmed to near darkness. "They're gone," he said softly. "You're safe." Lyra emerged first, her mobility device whirring as it helped lift her from the compartment. Despite the tension of the situation, she seemed almost excited. "We fooled them," she whispered, as if the traitors might still hear. Alara followed more cautiously, her eyes searching Kale's for confirmation that the danger had truly passed. "What happened?" "I convinced them my ship has unusual radiation because of a modified engine," he explained, helping them both to their feet. "They bought it, more or less. But we should be more careful for the rest of the journey. Stay away from the viewports in case anyone else scans us." That night, after Lyra had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from the day's excitement, Alara found Kale at the ship's controls. He was reprogramming their course, creating a more circuitous route to Helios Minor that would avoid the main shipping lanes. "You protected us," she said quietly, settling into the co-pilot's seat. "Put yourself at risk for two aliens you barely know." Kale kept his eyes on the navigation screen. "I made a promise." "To Lyra? Or to yourself?" He glanced at her, surprised by her perception. "Both, I suppose." Alara studied him in the dim light of the control panel. "On our world, before it died, we had a concept called Carven, souls who find each other across multiple lifetimes. Not always as family or lovers, but as people whose paths are destined to cross, whose lives change each other fundamentally." She paused. "I believe you are Carven to us, Kale. To Lyra, especially." "I don't believe in destiny," Kale replied, though something in her words resonated deeper than he cared to admit. "Perhaps not," Alara said with a small smile. "But it may believe in you." The remainder of their journey passed without incident, though Kale maintained a heightened vigilance. They rationed their supplies carefully, making do with minimal food and water. Lyra continued to adapt to her mobility device, growing more confident with each passing hour. By the time Helios Minor appeared on their scanners, she could walk the length of the ship with only occasional support from the walls. Helios Minor was a small moon orbiting a gas giant, its surface dominated by a sprawling spaceport that had grown organically over centuries. Unlike the orderly stations of the core systems, Helios Minor was a maze of interconnected structures, repurposed ships, and hastily constructed habitats. It was precisely this chaotic nature that made it perfect for those seeking anonymity. Kale guided the ship to a docking bay in one of the older sections. "We'll need disguises for you both," he told Alara and Lyra as they prepared to disembark. "Your species isn't common in this part of space. We don't want to attract attention." From the ship's limited supplies, he fashioned hooded cloaks that would conceal their luminescent skin and distinctive features. For Lyra, he made additional modifications to her mobility device, adding decorative panels that made it look more like fashionable tech than a medical necessity. "Remember," he instructed as they stood at the airlock, "stay close to me, speak only when necessary, and try to dim your natural glow as much as possible. Helios Minor is relatively safe, but it's still an outer rim trading post. All sorts pass through here." Alara nodded, pulling her hood lower over her face. "We've survived this long. We can manage a spaceport." Lyra, for her part, seemed more excited than afraid. "Will there be other children?" she asked, her voice barely containing her enthusiasm. "Probably," Kale answered, finding himself smiling at her eagerness despite his concerns. "But we need to be careful who we interact with, okay? Think of it as another hiding game." The spaceport was a sensory assault after the confined quiet of the ship. Vendors called out their wares in multiple languages, the air thick with the smells of exotic foods and mechanical lubricants. Beings of all shapes and sizes moved through the crowded corridors, most focused on their own business, paying little attention to three more travelers. Kale led them through the maze with the confidence of someone who had been there before, though it had been years since his last visit. Their first stop was a supply depot where he traded some of his salvage parts for credit, purchasing food, water, and basic necessities. "We need somewhere to stay while I arrange for passage to a better system," he explained as they navigated the crowded thoroughfare. "Someplace quiet where you won't have to hide constantly." After some negotiation at a lodging house run by an elderly human woman with a sympathetic disposition, they secured a small two-room habitat unit in a residential section of the port. It was modest but clean, with actual beds, a luxury after days in the cramped ship. Lyra immediately set about exploring every corner of their temporary home, her mobility device clicking softly against the metal flooring. Her joy at such simple comforts was infectious, drawing reluctant smiles from both adults. That evening, after Lyra had finally exhausted herself and fallen asleep, Kale and Alara sat at the small table in the common area, planning their next steps. Helios Minor connects to most major systems, Kale explained, pulling up a star chart on his portable display. "The question is, where do we go from here? Where would be safest for you both?" Alara considered the glowing map thoughtfully. "Our research team had identified several potential worlds that might support our physiology. Systems with specific atmospheric compositions and radiation levels." She pointed to a cluster of stars. "The Arcturus sector had the most promising candidates." "Arcturus is within the Alliance territories," Kale noted. "Stricter entry requirements, but better protections for refugees. It might be possible to get you there with the right connections." He hesitated before adding, "There's a colony world in that sector, New Haven. It was established specifically for displaced species whose home worlds were destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. Mixed population, progressive policies. Lyra might even find others of your kind there." "You've thought about this," Alara observed, studying his face. Kale shrugged. "Had a lot of time to think on the journey." "And what about you?" she asked quietly. "Where will you go once we reach this new haven?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't thought beyond getting them somewhere safe. The idea of separating hadn't fully formed in his mind, yet it was the logical conclusion. Once they were settled, his role would be complete. "I haven't decided," he answered honestly. "I've been drifting for years. No real plan beyond the next job, the next planet." "You could stay," Alara said, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "With us, if you wanted to." The possibility hung in the air between them, a chance at something he had deliberately avoided since the accident. Companionship, purpose, perhaps even family. Before he could respond, a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. They exchanged alarmed glances. No one should know they were here. Kale motioned for Alara to check on Lyra while he approached the door cautiously. When he opened it, he found the elderly landlady, her expression grave. "Port authorities conducting random checks," she whispered urgently. "Looking for undocumented aliens. Someone must have reported unusual readings in this sector. They're going door to door." "How long do we have?" Kale asked, his mind racing through options. "Minutes, maybe less," the woman replied. "There's a maintenance tunnel behind the building. It leads to the old storage districts. Not comfortable, but safer than here right now." Kale thanked her with a quick nod before closing the door and turning to Alara, who had returned with a groggy Lyra in her arms. "We need to leave. Now." He quickly gathered their essential supplies into a single pack. "Bring only what you can carry. We'll have to move fast." Lyra blinked sleepily. "Another hiding game?" "Yes, little one," Alara confirmed, setting her down and activating her mobility device. "The most important one yet." They slipped out the back entrance just as the sounds of official voices echoed from the main corridor. The maintenance tunnel was narrow and dimly lit, forcing them to move in single file. Kale led the way, with Lyra in the middle and Alara bringing up the rear, constantly checking for pursuers. The tunnel seemed endless, branching occasionally into even narrower passages. Kale navigated by instinct as much as memory, choosing paths that led deeper into the less populated sections of the port. Lyra kept pace admirably, her mobility device struggling occasionally with the uneven flooring but never failing completely. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a vast, dimly lit area filled with abandoned cargo containers and decommissioned ship parts. The storage district, a mechanical graveyard where the port's discarded technology came to rest. "We should be safe here for now," Kale said, helping Lyra sit on a sturdy crate. "Most of the equipment here is too old or damaged to be worth salvaging. Port Authority rarely bothers with inspections." Alara looked around, her natural luminescence providing additional light in the gloom. "What now? We can go back to our lodgings." Kale ran a hand through his hair, considering their options. "My ship is probably being watched too. We'll need an alternative way off Helios Minor." He paused, an idea forming. "I know someone who might help, an old contact who operates off the official registry. It's a risk, but he owes me a favor." "Can we trust this person?" Alara asked, her protective instincts clearly on high alert. "Enzo's not exactly trustworthy by nature," Kale admitted, "but he's pragmatic, and a paid debt is a closed ledger to him." He glanced at Lyra, who was already exploring their new surroundings with characteristic curiosity. "I'll need to go alone, though. You'll both be safer here than moving through the port." Alara's expression tightened with concern. "And if you don't come back?" The question was practical rather than accusatory, but it still stung. "I'll come back," Kale promised. "You're not alone anymore, remember?" After ensuring they had water, food, and a defensible position among the containers, Kale prepared to leave. To his surprise, Lyra approached him, her steps determined despite her fatigue. "You need to be careful," she said seriously, looking up at him with those enormous violet eyes. "The bad people might be looking for you too." Kale knelt to her level. "I will be, and I'll be back before you know it. Keep practicing with your walking device, okay? I want to see how much better you've gotten when I return." She nodded solemnly before throwing her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. Over her shoulder, he met Alara's gaze, worried but resolute, trusting him despite all the reasons she shouldn't. Navigating back through the port was a tense affair. Kale kept to the shadows, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Port Authority guards conducted their checks. Twice he had to duck into alcoves to avoid patrols. It seemed the random inspection had expanded into a full sweep of the spaceport. Enzo's establishment was located in one of the oldest sections of Helios Minor, a cantina built into the hull of a decommissioned freighter. The clientele was diverse, but universally rough around the edges: smugglers, mercenaries, and those with reason to avoid official attention. Kale slipped in through a side entrance, scanning the dimly lit interior for his contact. He found Enzo behind the bar, a burly human with cybernetic augmentations visible along his jawline and left arm. Recognition dawned in Enzo's eyes as Kale approached. Well, he drawled, wiping a glass with a rag of questionable cleanliness. "The ghost returns. Last I heard, you were spacing solo, avoiding entanglements. Yet here you are, right when every authority on this rock is looking for suspicious travelers." "Coincidence," Kale replied, sliding onto a bar stool. "I'm calling in that favor you owe me, Enzo." The bartender's augmented eye word is it. "Focused. Must be serious if you're caching that particular chip. What do you need? Quick exit, clean identity, transport, off registry, to the Arcturus sector." Enzo whistled low. "Alliance space? That's a tall order, my friend. Border security's tighter than a vacuum seal these days." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "This have anything to do with the unusual life forms Port Authority is so interested in finding?" Kale kept his expression neutral. "The favor, Enzo? Yes or no?" After a moment of consideration, the bartender nodded. "I know a pilot. Hauls medical supplies to the outer colonies. Has the clearances for Alliance space and doesn't ask questions." He tapped his cybernetic fingers on the bar top. "She's leaving tomorrow at Cycle Dawn. Bay 42, maintenance level. Tell her Enzo sent you and the debt is cleared." "Thank you," Kale said, already rising to leave. "Kale," Enzo called after him. "Whatever you're involved in, whoever you're protecting, I hope it's worth the trouble. Kale paused, thinking of Lyra's determined steps, of Alara's resilience. It is. As he turned to go, a commotion at the main entrance caught his attention. Port Authority guards were conducting checks of everyone entering or leaving. Kale cursed under his breath and moved quickly toward the kitchen, seeking an alternative exit. He had nearly reached the back door when a rough hand grabbed his shoulder. Identity verification demanded a uniformed guard, scanner already raised. Kale reacted on instinct, twisting away and shoving the guard back into a stack of containers. The crash drew attention from the front of the cantina, including more guards who immediately started in his direction. With no choice left, Kale bolted through the kitchen and out into the service corridor beyond. Shouts followed him as he ran, ducking through the labyrinthine back passages of the spaceport's older section. His knowledge of Helios Minor gave him an advantage, but the guards were organized and familiar with common escape routes. After several minutes of evasion, he found himself cornered in a maintenance bay. 2 guards blocked the only exit, weapons drawn. "Hands where we can see them," commanded the lead officer. Identity verification and destination tracking are mandatory during security alerts. Kale raised his hands slowly, mind racing for a solution. He couldn't afford to be detained, not with Alara and Lyra waiting for his return, not with their narrow window of escape closing fast. As the guards approached with scanner in hand, the overhead lights suddenly flickered and died, plunging the maintenance bay into darkness. In the confusion that followed, Kale felt someone grab his arm and pull him sideways through a panel he hadn't noticed in the wall. "Move quickly," whispered a familiar voice, the elderly landlady from their lodgings. "There's not much time." She led him through a hidden passageway that seemed to run between the walls of the port structure. "I saw you heading toward Enzo's," she explained as they hurried along. "When the guards entered, I knew you'd need an exit strategy. Why are you helping us?" Kale asked, stunned by the unexpected assistance. The old woman's face hardened in the dim emergency lighting. "My daughter married an off-worlder. They were denied entry at 3 different ports before finding sanctuary. Not everyone believes different means dangerous." She guided him through a series of turns until they emerged in a quiet corridor several sections away from the cantina. "Your friends are still in the storage district?" Kale nodded, still processing the fortunate intervention. "Get them to Bay 42 before cycle dawn," she instructed. "There's a medical transport leaving for Arcturus. Your best chance." She pressed something into his hand, a small data chip. "Show this to the pilot. It'll help smooth the way." Before Kale could thank her properly, she melted back into the hidden passage, leaving him alone in the corridor with the precious information that might secure their escape. The return journey to the storage district was even more harrowing. Security had increased, with patrols now checking identification at every major intersection. Kale was forced to take increasingly circuitous routes, losing valuable time with each detour. By the time he reached the container yard, his nerves were frayed. He approached their hiding spot cautiously, giving a soft whistle, the signal they had arranged before his departure. No response came. Heart racing, Kale moved closer, peering into the space where he had left Alara and Lyra. Empty. No sign of struggle, but definitely abandoned. "Alara," he called softly, fear clawing at his throat. "Lyra." Movement from behind a nearby container caught his attention. He whirled, reaching for his pulse pistol, only to freeze at the sight of familiar glowing skin. "Kale!" Lyra's small voice quavered with relief as she peered out from her hiding place. "You came back." She hobbled toward him, her mobility device moving smoothly despite the rough terrain. Behind her, Alara emerged from the shadows, her expression a mixture of relief and residual tension. "We heard patrols," she explained as they reunited. "Had to move deeper into the storage area." Kale knelt to check Lyra's device, using the moment to compose himself. The surge of panic he'd felt at finding them gone had been overwhelming, far stronger than he'd anticipated. "I found us a way out," he said, rising to his feet. "A medical transport leaving for Arcturus at cycle dawn. We need to move now if we're going to make it." Alara nodded, gathering their few possessions. Lyra's device is holding up well. She's getting faster. Good, Kale said, smiling at the child's proud expression. Because we've got a long way to go and not much time to get there. The journey to Bay 42 was a tense exercise in stealth and patience. They used maintenance tunnels where possible, service corridors when necessary, and twice had to hide in utility closets while patrols passed. Lyra remained remarkably calm throughout, following instructions perfectly and moving as quietly as her mechanical legs would allow. They reached the maintenance level with less than an hour before cycle dawn. Bay 42 was located in a quiet section reserved for specialized transport, medical supplies, diplomatic couriers, and other priority shipments that bypassed the main commercial traffic. The vessel dock there was sleek and unmarked, its design suggesting speed rather than cargo capacity. A lone figure worked at the external control panel, preparing for departure. "Wait here," Kale whispered, positioning Alara and Lyra in the shadows of a support column. "Let me make contact first." He approached openly, hands visible to show he meant no threat. The figure at the control panel, a tall woman with close-cropped silver hair and dark skin, turned at his approach, her hand moving subtly toward what was likely a concealed weapon. "Enzo sent me," Kale said without preamble. "I understand you're bound for Arcturus." The pilot's expression remained impassive. "Enzo should know better than to volunteer my services without consultation." Kale produced the data chip the landlady had given him. "I was told this might help explain the situation." The woman took the chip, inserting it into her wrist computer. Whatever information it contained caused a slight softening in her stern features. 3 passengers total? Kale nodded, relief washing through him. "Yes, myself and 2 others. No official documentation, but we can pay." He indicated the pack containing the remaining salvage parts he'd kept back from his earlier trades. The pilot pocketed the chip. "Keep your payment. This debt's being covered elsewhere." She gestured toward the ship's hatch. "Board quickly. We depart in 20 minutes. Kale signaled to Alara, who emerged from hiding with Lyra at her side. The pilot's eyes widened slightly at their alien appearance, but she made no comment, simply stepping aside to allow them entry. The interior of the vessel was sparse but immaculate, clearly a professional operation. The pilot directed them to a small passenger compartment separate from the cockpit. "Secure yourselves for departure," she instructed. "Once we clear Port Authority, you can move about the cabin. It's 3 days to the Arcturus checkpoint, then another day to New Haven Colony. I don't need to know your story, and you don't need to know mine." "Clear." They nodded in agreement, grateful for the no-questions approach. As the pilot returned to the cockpit, Lyra settled herself into one of the acceleration couches, her mobility device whirring as she adjusted her position. "Is this really happening?" she asked, looking between Kale and Alara. "Are we going somewhere safe?" "Yes, little one," Alara assured her, securing the safety harness around the child's small frame. "Somewhere with real sky and clean air. Somewhere you can walk on grass instead of metal." Lyra's face lit up at the prospect, her luminescence brightening with excitement. "And we'll all be together, right? You and me and Kale." The question hung in the air. Alara's eyes met Kale's over Lyra's head, the same uncertainty reflected in both their gazes. They hadn't discussed what would happen after reaching New Haven. The assumption had always been that Kale would deliver them safely, then continue his solitary existence. But something had changed in the days since finding them on Xylos. The emptiness that had driven him from planet to planet, the guilt that had kept him isolated, they had been gradually replaced by something else, something that felt dangerously like belonging. Before either adult could respond, the ship's engines hummed to life. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Prepare for departure. Port Authority has granted clearance." As the vessel lifted smoothly from the docking bay, Lyra reached out, taking Kale's hand in her small one. "Thank you for helping me walk," she said, her violet eyes solemn. "And for finding us a new home." Home! The word resonated in Kale's mind as the ship accelerated away from Helios Minor, carrying them toward an uncertain future. He had spent years avoiding attachments, convinced that he didn't deserve them after his failure. Yet here he was, hand in hand with a child who looked at him with trust and affection, beside a woman who had offered him a place in their lives. Perhaps Alara was right. Perhaps some connections were destined, regardless of our attempts to avoid them. Perhaps second chances came in forms we never expected. As the stars streaked past the viewport, Kale squeezed Lyra's hand gently. "You're welcome," he said quietly. And then, meeting Alara's gaze, he added, "We'll figure out the rest together." 3 weeks later, Kale stood on the porch of a small dwelling on the outskirts of New Haven Colony. The sun was setting over rolling hills covered in blue-green vegetation, casting long shadows across the landscape. In the valley below, the lights of the colony's central hub were beginning to twinkle on as night approached. Their arrival had been smoother than expected. The colony, true to its name and founding principles, welcomed displaced species with minimal bureaucracy. Alara's scientific background had quickly secured her a position in the xenobotany department, where her intimate knowledge of her own planet's flora proved valuable to the colony's agricultural experiments. Lyra had been enrolled in the colony's diverse education center, where children of various species learned together. Her mobility device, now upgraded with locally sourced components, allowed her nearly normal movement. Each day, she returned home with new stories, new discoveries, her natural curiosity flourishing in an environment free from danger and secrecy. And Kale had found his own place, surprisingly enough. His technical skills were in high demand in a colony always in need of maintenance and innovation. The settlement's unified power grid still needed work, and his experience with salvaging and repurposing technology made him uniquely qualified to help improve it. They had settled into this small home on the colony's edge, modest but comfortable, with actual windows and solid walls instead of metal panels. A real home, not a hiding place or temporary shelter. The sound of mechanical whirring announced Lyra's approach before he saw her. She moved with growing confidence across the yard, her device barely visible beneath the flowing dress Alara had made for her from local fibers. "Kale, Kale," she called excitedly. "Dr. Norin says my legs are getting stronger. The nerve regeneration treatment is working better than they expected." He turned to greet her with a smile. "That's wonderful news, Starlight. Soon you might not need the device at all." Lyra's luminescence dimmed slightly, her expression turning thoughtful. "But I like my walking machine. You made it for me." She patted the frame attached to her legs with genuine affection. "It was my first gift." The simple statement caught Kale off guard. In all his years of engineering, of building and repairing complex technologies, nothing had ever meant as much as the crude device he'd fashioned from salvage parts on Xylos. Nothing had ever brought him the same sense of purpose and redemption. "The device will always be yours," he assured her, kneeling to her level. "But think how amazing it will be when you can choose to use it or to walk on your own." Lyra considered this, then nodded solemnly. "I could still use it for running really fast." A mischievous smile spread across her face. "Or jumping really high." "Exactly," Kale laughed, rising to his feet. "Now, go wash up for dinner. Alara should be home soon." As Lyra headed inside, Kale remained on the porch, watching the final rays of sunlight disappear beyond the horizon. The peaceful scene was a stark contrast to the corroded hellscape of Xylos, where their journey had begun. Sometimes he still woke in the night, certain he could smell the acrid air or hear the groaning of failing metal structures. The memories remained, but their power over him diminished a little more each day. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Alara was walking up the path from the colony center, her natural luminescence brightening the growing darkness. She had adapted to New Haven with remarkable resilience, embracing the opportunity to contribute her knowledge while maintaining the cultural practices of her lost world. In the evenings, she would teach Lyra the songs and stories of their people, ensuring the child would never forget her heritage. "You look contemplative," Alara observed as she joined him on the porch. "Deep thoughts. Just appreciating the view," Kale replied, though they both knew he meant more than just the landscape. Alara's luminescence pulsed. Gently, a subtle expression of contentment in her species. The xenobotany team made a breakthrough today. We successfully hybridized one of our native plants with a local variety. It may help with atmospheric filtration in the new biodomes. That's excellent news, Kale said. The colony council will be pleased. And you? She asked, moving closer beside him. How was your day? Productive. The northern grid is finally stable. He paused, then added, and Lyra just told me the regeneration treatments are working better than expected. Alara's expression brightened. Dr. Norin mentioned they were seeing promising results. It's more than we could have hoped for when we arrived. They stood in comfortable silence, watching as more lights appeared in the colony below. After a moment, Alara's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally, a gesture that had become familiar over the weeks. There's something I've been meaning to ask you, she said, her tone shifting to something more serious. The colony administrator approached me today about formalization. Kale turned to face her, recognizing the significance. Formalization was New Haven's process for officially recognizing family units, particularly those formed through circumstance rather than biological relation. It granted legal rights and responsibilities, ensuring that makeshift families like theirs had the same protections as traditional ones. What did you tell them? He asked, his heart rate accelerating slightly. That I would discuss it with you, Alara replied, her violet eyes searching his face. This was never part of the plan, Kale. When you found us on Xylos, when you helped Lyra walk, when you got us safely here, none of it came with an obligation to stay. I know that, he said quietly, but Lyra adores you. And I. She hesitated, her luminescence flickering with emotion. I've come to rely on your presence in ways I never expected. Yet I wouldn't want you to feel trapped by our gratitude. Kale considered her words carefully. The possibility of leaving had become increasingly distant in his mind, fading a little more with each passing day. The solitary existence he had maintained for years no longer called to him. Instead, he found himself planning for a future, renovations to their home, improvements to Lyra's device, a garden they could plant when the weather turned. I don't feel trapped, he said finally. For the first time since the accident, I feel free. Free from guilt. Free from running. He squeezed her hand gently. I want the formalization, Alara. I want to be a family, officially, legally, in every way that matters. Relief and joy spread across her features, her luminescence brightening to an intensity he had rarely seen. You're certain? Once formalized, the colony recognizes the bonds as permanent. I've never been more certain of anything, Kale assured her. He glanced toward the house, where Lyra was visible through the window, setting the table for dinner with careful concentration. After all, some connections are destined, right? Carvin, you called it. Alara's eyes widened in surprise at his reference to her people's concept of soul-connected individuals. You remembered. I remember everything you've told me, he said softly. And I want to learn more. All the traditions, the language, the stories. Everything that makes you who you are. Before she could respond, the door flew open and Lyra bounded out, her mobility device allowing her to move with surprising speed. Dinner's ready. I helped make it, she announced proudly. Did you now? Alara laughed, lifting the child into a hug. And what culinary masterpiece awaits us tonight? Protein cubes with vegetation, Lyra declared, mimicking the formal way the colony's food dispensary described their nutritional offerings. But I arranged them in a pattern, so they're fancy protein cubes. Sounds delicious, Kale assured her with mock seriousness. Lead the way, chef. As they followed Lyra inside, Alara paused in the doorway. We should tell her tonight, she whispered. About the formalization. Kale nodded in agreement. She'll be thrilled. She's been calling us a family since Helios Minor. The interior of their home was simple but comfortable, decorated with a mixture of colony-provided furnishings and personal touches they had added over the weeks. Lyra had insisted on hanging colorful fabrics from the ceiling, reminiscent of the luminescent mosses that had adorned her species' dwellings on their homeworld. Kale had built shelves and storage units from locally sourced materials, while Alara had begun cultivating potted plants that gave the air a fresh, slightly sweet scent. Dinner was indeed protein cubes and local vegetables, but Lyra had arranged them in an intricate pattern that showed surprising artistic talent. They ate together, sharing stories from their day, a routine that had developed naturally since their arrival. Lyra chattered excitedly about her school experiences, her mobility device occasionally whirring as she gesticulated enthusiastically. When the meal was finished, Illyra exchanged a meaningful glance with Cale. He nodded, indicating she should take the lead. Lyra, she began gently. Cale and I have something important to tell you. The child looked between them, instantly alert to the serious tone. Is something wrong? Are we leaving again? Fear flashed across her features, a reminder that despite her resilience, the trauma of repeated displacement remained close to the surface. No, little one, Cale assured her quickly. Quite the opposite. We're staying here permanently. Relief washed over Lyra's face, but confusion lingered in her eyes. But we already decided that, didn't we? When we got our house. Yes, but there's more, Illyra explained. The colony has a special process called formalization. It's a way for people who have chosen to be a family to make it official. Like what your parents had, a permanent bond recognized by everyone. Lyra's luminescence brightened as understanding dawned. You mean, we'll be a real family? Not just living together. That's right, Cale confirmed. If that's what you want to. Of course it is, Lyra exclaimed, her excitement causing her to rise so suddenly that her mobility device struggled to keep up. When does it happen? Is there a ceremony? Do I get to wear something special? Illyra laughed, her relief evident. Yes to all of those questions. The colony has traditional ceremonies for formalization. We can schedule it whenever we're ready. Tomorrow, Lyra suggested hopefully. Maybe not quite that soon, Cale smiled. But soon. We need to prepare properly. Later that night, after Lyra had finally been persuaded to go to bed despite her excitement, Cale and Illyra sat together in the small living area. Through the window, the 3 moons of New Haven cast a gentle, multicolored light across the landscape. She took the news well, Cale observed wryly. As if there was ever any doubt, Illyra replied. She's been dropping hints for weeks. Nayla's parents are formalized. Tarek has 2 fathers who are formalized. When will we be formalized? Subtle. Our Lyra is not. Cale agreed with a chuckle. Our Lyra, Illyra repeated softly. It still amazes me, sometimes, how we found each other in that desolate place. How you chose to help us when there was nothing to gain. I gained everything, Cale said, his voice low with emotion. You both gave me a reason to stop running from my past. To build something new instead of just surviving day to day. Illyra moved closer, her luminescence dimming to a soft, intimate glow. On my world, formalization included an exchange of promises, not just to each other, but to the community, to the future. What would your promise be, Cale? He considered the question carefully. I would promise to never take this second chance for granted. To protect what we've built together. To honor your traditions and help create new ones. He paused, then added, and to keep improving Lyra's mobility device until she outgrows it completely. Illyra smiled at the last addition. She'll never truly outgrow it, you know, even when her legs are fully healed. If that day comes, she'll keep it as a reminder of when her life changed. When someone saw her value beyond her limitations. What about you? Cale asked. What would your promise be? To remember that family isn't just about where you come from, but who you choose, she replied without hesitation. To keep the best parts of my world alive through stories and traditions, while embracing this new world we've found. And her voice softened, to help heal the wounds you still carry, just as you've helped heal Lyra's. The sincerity in her voice touched something deep within Cale, a place he had long kept walled off from others. With gentle fingertips, he traced the pattern of luminescence along her cheek, a gesture of affection he had learned was significant in her culture. I think those are promises worth making, he said softly. The formalization ceremony took place 3 weeks later, in a small amphitheater nestled among the hills overlooking the colony. It was a perfect example of New Haven's philosophy, a space designed to accommodate the cultural practices of multiple species, adaptable to various traditions while maintaining its own distinct character. Representatives from several colony departments attended, along with Lyra's teachers and classmates, and colleagues from both Kale's engineering team and Alara's xenobotany project. The colony administrator, a tall being with iridescent scales similar to the officer they had encountered on the trading vessel, presided over the ceremony. Lyra had been granted the honor of serving as the ceremony's focal point, the heart of the new family unit being formalized. She took this responsibility with utmost seriousness, practicing her role for days beforehand. She wore a new dress specially designed to accommodate her mobility device while showcasing the traditional patterns of her people, which Alara had carefully recreated from memory. The ceremony itself blended elements from multiple cultures. There was an exchange of promises, as Alara had described, spoken first in the melodic language of their species, then translated for the gathered community. Kale had spent weeks practicing the pronunciation, determined to honor the tradition properly. When it came time for Lyra's part, she stepped forward with newfound confidence, her mobility device humming softly as it supported her movements. In her hands, she carried a small container of soil, a symbol of the new roots they were establishing together. "With this earth from our new home," she recited clearly, "I connect our past to our future." She placed the container in a larger vessel that would later be used to plant a tree near their dwelling, a living symbol of their formalized bond. The colony administrator then presented them with a formal document recording their status as a family unit under colony law. "By the authority vested in me by the Charter of New Haven Colony, I recognize and affirm the formation of this family unit. May your bonds strengthen both yourselves and our community." A cheer went up from the gathered witnesses, and Lyra's classmates released small floating lanterns that drifted upward in the gentle breeze. As tradition dictated, the newly formalized family walked together through an arch formed by the assembled community members, symbolizing their passage into a new status. At the celebration that followed, Kale found himself momentarily alone, watching as Alara and Lyra were congratulated by well-wishers. From this vantage point, he could see the full scope of the colony. The central hub with its biodomes and research facilities, the residential areas spreading outward in concentric circles, and beyond, the untamed landscape of New Haven waiting to be explored. A small hand slipped into his, and he looked down to find Lyra beside him. "Are you happy, Kale?" she asked, her violet eyes searching his face with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see right through any pretense. "Happier than I've been in a very long time," he answered honestly. "Me too," she nodded solemnly. Then, with the directness of a child, she added, "Can I call you father now? Officially?" The question caught him by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. They had discussed many aspects of their new status, but this particular detail had remained unaddressed. "If that's what you want," he said carefully, "I would be honored, but only if it feels right to you." Lyra considered this with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Alara says my first father will always be my father, even though he's gone. She says hearts can hold more than one person in the same place." "Alara is very wise," Kale agreed, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I think," Lyra said slowly, "that my first father would be happy that I found you, that we all found each other." Her luminescence brightened with confidence. "So yes, it feels right." Before Kale could respond, Alara joined them, her hand naturally finding his as she had become accustomed to doing. "What are you two conspiring about over here?" she asked lightly. "Family names," Lyra answered promptly, "and how hearts can hold more than one person in the same place." Alara's eyes met Kale's, understanding passing between them without words. "Indeed they can," she agreed softly. As the celebration continued around them, the three stood together, looking out over the colony and the world beyond, a world of possibilities that had seemed unimaginable on that first day on Xylos. The broken alien girl who couldn't walk now stood tall between them, supported both by the device Kale had created and by the family they had formed together. From the corroded wasteland of a dying planet to the fertile promise of New Haven, their journey had transformed them all. Kale, who had once believed himself unworthy of connection, now stood at the center of a family formally recognized before an entire community. Alara, who had fought so desperately to protect the last remnant of her people, now helped shape the future of a diverse colony where difference was celebrated rather than feared. And Lyra, whose damaged legs had once defined her limitations, now explored her world with growing independence, her resilience and inspiration to all who knew her story. As twilight settled over New Haven Colony, Lyra looked up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. "Which one was Xylos?" she asked curiously. Kale pointed to a faint pinprick of light barely visible on the horizon. "There, very far away now. And getting farther every day," Alara added. Lyra nodded, satisfied with this knowledge. Then, with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possess, she said, "It was a sad place, but I'm glad we were there. Otherwise, we might never have found each other." Kale and Alara exchanged a glance over her head, a look that acknowledged the truth of her words and the strange paths that had led them to this moment. Sometimes the most broken places held the possibility of the most profound healing. Sometimes the darkest circumstances revealed the brightest connections. "Come," Alara said, as the evening grew cooler. "Let's go home." Together, the three of them turned away from the vista and walked back toward their dwelling. No longer three separate individuals bound by circumstance and necessity, but a family moving forward into a shared future. Lyra's mobility device hummed softly as they went, a reminder of where their journey had begun and how far they had already come. Behind them, the stars continued their eternal dance across the sky, including the distant point of light that was Xylos, the corroded world where no one had helped the little broken alien girl who couldn't walk, until a man with his own broken past had given her a second chance, and in doing so, had found his own.